Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the first of this academic year's webinars from the Faculty of Classics. My name's James Warren. I'm Professor of Ancient Philosophy and I'm Chair of the Faculty Board of Classics at the moment. The academic year 2022-3 is a really important year for us in the Faculty of Classics because it marks the coincidence of two really important anniversaries that mark really significant changes in the way our degree works and in the way in which we teach classics to our undergraduates. In this academic year, we're celebrating 50 years of our intensive Greek course. So that's the course that was inaugurated to allow students who hadn't studied Greek at all at school to come and take a 3-year degree in classics. Now, for most of the time of the IG has been in place, students on that track did already have to have Latin before they arrived. For example, I myself was an intensive Greek student in the 90s. I was fortunate enough to have A-level Latin from school, but didn't have any Greek. So Cambridge was where I was able to learn Greek. But 20 years ago, we inaugurated a 4-year classics course aimed specifically for those students who've had the chance to study neither Latin nor Greek previously at school. Obviously, it was a bit too much to ask them to do both of those from scratch in just the 3 years. So we made it possible that they could spend an additional year at the beginning of the course to allow them to get together some of those linguistic skills that they need. And then it was really important to us that they join in the standard classics degree. So to think a bit more about the history of those two courses, about their current position in the faculty and what the future might hold, it's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce our 3 dedicated language teaching leaders amongst our members of staff. So in alphabetical order, they begin with Franco Basso, who is Associate Professor of Classics and a Fellow of Gonville and Caius College. Rosanna Omitowoju, who's Associate Professor of Classics and a Fellow of King's College, and Charlie Weiss, who's an Associate Professor of Classics and a Fellow of Clare College. And between them, they're responsible for planning, arranging, and delivering the great majority of our classes, the faculty classes, aimed at teaching the students Latin and Greek. So between them, they're going to take us through some of the questions and interesting history of these courses, and then perhaps say something about where they might go into the future. Before I hand over to them, anyone who is a participant in the webinar, please do put any questions that you would like me to put to our panelists in the Q&A section of the Zoom. I think you'll find that if you go to the bottom of your screen, there'll be a little box and you can type in a question there. What we're hoping to do is to have them talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for me to put your questions to them and for you to ask what you want to know about the way the course is working. So I think we're going to start looking back to the deep history of intensive Greek as a course in the faculty, and I think Franco is going to take us through that. So the rest of us are going to take a back seat for a moment, but we'll be with you momentarily. Franco, you need to turn your microphone on.
Thank you very much for that. It's a very helpful tip. Thank you, James. So as we've just heard, the teaching of Greek in the Cambridge Faculty of Classics to students who have not studied it before, or at least not to A-level standards, has been a defining feature of classics teaching in Cambridge for 50 years. And this amount of time is long enough to make its origin now seem purely or largely a matter of historical interest, or perhaps less ambitiously of antiquarian curiosity. Nothing objectionable with history, I hope, and nothing too reprehensible with antiquarianism either. But what I've discovered is that as a topic, the history of the Cambridge Greek course is made rather difficult by a serious lack of evidence. Starting from 1970, and then with increasing frequency in 71 and 72, the minutes of the meetings of the faculty board, which are preserved in the faculty, contain a number of tantalizing references to reports from the faculty planning committee and then from a newly created management committee for beginners Greek, but nothing is actually recorded in the minutes other than the reports have been received and, when relevant, approved. The documents themselves are not preserved either in the Faculty of Classics or in the section of the university archives which contains the materials from the Faculty of Classics. One might speculate that perhaps the relocation of the faculty to its present buildings in 1982 might have had, so to say, an adverse effect on its archival holding. Or perhaps the private files of some faculty members might contain some of these documents. For the time being, I've not been able to find any significant faculty document dealing with the creation of the intensive Greek course. So I'll tell you the little which I have found. One would expect a matter of such importance to have been discussed informally for some time, but the first evidence that I've been able to locate in the minutes is of a special meeting of the faculty board on the 23rd of April, 1970, in which a recommendation of the planning committee was accepted that, I quote, "the classical tripos be revised to make it suitable for entrants with much less knowledge of Greek. Further decisions were deferred to a later date." This is a quotation. The wording "much less knowledge of Greek" seems to me potentially significant, both for its vagueness, but also and especially perhaps for stopping short of introducing the word beginners. Does the decision to defer indicate the discussion was still ongoing within the faculty? If so, things must have moved rather fast, because as soon as the 9th of May 1970, another special meeting of the faculty board was held, and at which, and then I quote again, "the report of the Committee for Beginners Greek was considered, and it was agreed to establish forthwith a management (bracket not teaching) committee for Beginners Greek." Then we have the list of the committee member, and the minute concludes with an auspice that may still read somehow relevant. It was thought desirable that participation in any teaching course of Greek for beginners should be widely distributed among the teaching officers of the faculty. As it would be apparent from the few sentences that I've quoted, minutes of the faculty board were taken to record decisions or wishes and not the discussion which accompanied those decisions. So one is left searching for clues, and there is a great risk of overinterpreting. But it is noticeable, I would say, that at least the entrance with the word entrance with much less knowledge has been changing to beginners within the space of 2 weeks. But the matter was still regarded as in need of discussion because another meeting of the faculty was held at the beginning of the next academic year. And the minutes simply record that a draft report for the institution of a beginner's Greek course to be sent to the liaison committee for their comments and submitted to the faculty at the annual general meeting of November 19th. Now, the matter was being regarded as sufficiently momentous to require formal approval by the faculty as a whole is interesting. Unfortunately, here again, the minutes of the faculty, as opposed to the minutes of the faculty board, are not preserved. And so one does not know how the proposal was received by the faculty as a whole. In any case, the meeting of 8 October 1970 was the last special meeting on the matter, because when beginners Greek reappears in the minutes of the faculty board is as an item for the ordinary meeting of 20th of May 1970. And this is perhaps the most interesting of all entries, the one of 20th of May 1970, because under the heading Beginners Greek, we read, "It was agreed that the managing committee for intensive Greek, capital I and capital G, be asked to consider means for making known to prospective candidates the arrangement for beginners course and to make recommendation to the board, etc., etc." The etc., etc. is actually in the minutes. It's not that I've removed any information. So even though we don't learn how and why, what we still learn, at least from this scanty minutes, is that at some point between October and May 1970, the course acquired a new name, Intensive Greek, and that name it has kept ever since. The choice of name was, and arguably remains, very significant, because it points to an approach that has now lasted for serious and important reasons for half a century. The idea behind the name is that if Greek has not studied before university, it will be studied here in Cambridge at such a pace and with such intensity as to make it possible for those who take the course in the first year to continue studying for a classical tripos that presuppose fairly advanced knowledge of the language. It is remarkable, on the other hand, that nowhere in the minutes we should find a reference to what is perhaps the most important practical consequence of this approach. And I'm referring to the fact that the intensive Greek course has been fundamentally relying, ever since its beginning, on the commitment of those who apply for it to learn quite a significant amount of Greek before they start the course. And this remains a formal condition that colleges make when offering a place on this course. That this was the case from the very beginning, one only discovers when the course is finally presented in the prospectus of Cambridge Classical Courses for 1972-73, in which we learn, and I quote, "For those who have been admitted to read a new tripos and have not taken high-level Greek, some serious preparations is necessary during the summer before they come up. Director of Studies will give them advice about this, and they will almost certainly be advised to attend the summer school in ancient Greek at Cheltenham, run by JAC, the Joint Association of Classical Teachers. Systematic instruction in beginners Greek is also provided throughout a student's first year at Cambridge." That's rather reassuring. In September, immediately before the beginning of the Michaelmas term, there is a follow-up course lasting a week. This is designed to consolidate previous work and to provide orientation. That was 50 years ago. The last such course that we now call pre-term happened about a month ago. So that also has remained a feature of the way in which the intensive Greek course is run, the September one-week pre-terminal series of classes. I will stop here because I think this is enough as a way of historical introduction, and I will pass as it were the baton to my colleague Rosanna, who will be talking about the origins of the Latin course.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen so that I can do a bit of, do a little PowerPoint. I'm afraid it's telling me that my screen sharing facility has been disabled, which it shouldn't because I'm a, oh, there we go. Okay, so this is a PowerPoint about the four-year degree in particular. There's a picture of me with one of my students there, actually one of our students who was in the Greek play only a couple of weeks ago. As I was introduced by James, I'm an associate professor in classics, and I have a particular specialism for the language teaching side of things, and I'm also director of studies at a couple of colleges. I'm going to start as well by going backwards in history a little bit to 1988, which was when there was the national curriculum, when that came into force. And that's a really important moment for classical subjects, because, as I'm sure you know, it was a moment where neither Latin nor Greek were included in the national curriculum. So the incentive for schools, and perhaps particularly we should think here about state schools, to teach these rather complicated, rather niche subjects really diminished enormously. And so that was a difficult moment for the health of the subject within the British education system. A short time after that, another event occurred, which was a TQA, a teaching quality assessment of what was going on in Cambridge Classics, in which I'm pleased to say we did really well. We came out with an excellent or outstanding grading. And as a result of that and the kind of positive feeling that was generated, the university began to be very open to the idea of us starting a from scratch degree. This was particularly important as a way of keeping the subject going, keeping it alive, and particularly making it possible for people from state schools, or indeed from any schools which weren't offering classical subjects, able to take a classics degree in Cambridge. There was a committee, probably made more extensive notes than the minutes that Franco was talking about a moment ago. But we set up the 4-year degree effectively as a year bolted on the front. Now, on one level, that looked, and still to a certain extent does look, somewhat clunky. We have a 3-year degree and a 4-year course, which is a year stuck on the front of that. But in many ways, that's one of its great strengths. As James referred to earlier on, the students who do the 4-year degree do the preliminary year, that first year, and then are right in with everybody else. And that was something that was fundamentally important to us in the way that we set it up, that it wasn't that the students who were doing the 4-year degree had some sort of different experience, or perhaps had to spend much longer focused on basic language learning or anything like that. It was extremely important to us that they had access to the full swathe of classical disciplines, and that they were all-round classicists in the way that we expected our 3-year students to be. People who might be doing it because they had a great passion for the languages, but people who were just as likely to be doing it because they were budding ancient historians or very keen literature students, and were prepared to put in the grit and grind to learn the ancient languages, to do it properly for the ancient world. It's a tough call, and it still is a tough call. We've been running for about 4 years, and as with all students who study classics, we managed to teach them a load of very transferable skills. We have students who've gone into a whole range of careers following on from their classics degree. Some have remained as classicists, either as teachers or as academics, but they've gone into a whole range of subjects, just as our 3-year classicists do. Interesting to note that we've got 2 or 3 ex-4-year degree students who have gone into graduate medicine, and I'm still in touch quite closely with a student from the first year of the 4-year degree who's actually now a qualified doctor in the NHS, and who still remembers her time as a classicist as being fundamental in setting her on a career in which she felt that she could take on any body of knowledge and learn it and come to grips with it. We're in a patch at the moment where, very excitingly, the 4-year course seems to be growing. In the early 2000s, we mostly had quite small cohorts of students, perhaps in the kind of 10 to 12, creeping up into the teens sometimes. Even as recently as 2016 to 2017, we only had a cohort of 10. That was a bit of a dip from the years before that. But since then, we've been gradually growing. 2017 to 18, we had 12. In 2018 to 19, 21. In 2019 to 2020, 30. And then some stable numbers in those 3 years, 30, 30, 28. But then, very pleasingly, in our most recent year, we had quite a significant uptake, both in terms of our levels of applications, but then in terms of the numbers who we admitted. So we currently have a cohort who started a month or so ago of 41 students. As I've said here, that makes up roughly 40% of our 2022 intake. So there's been a very big shift back from the early 2000s, where it was a small cohort, a small group within a much bigger 3-year cohort. And we're now heading towards 40%, 45%, maybe even heading towards 50% in the not too distant future. And just as a little coda to that, even after I put this PowerPoint together, we've had application levels for this coming year. And indeed, the 4-year degree application level is only just marginally below the number of applicants for the 3-year course. So we really are heading in a much more 50-50 type of direction. So how do we do this? Well, we still manage, despite these growing numbers, to have small groups. And the small group teaching scenario is something that's extremely important to us. It's intensive, and we get on to text reading as soon as we possibly can. And something that's always been important, and I would say this is every bit as important within the intensive Greek course as it is within the 4-year course, which of course dovetail together anyway. Something that's crucially important to us is reading texts in a multi-layered way. Here's a nice bit of text. Bella terra et mari cavillia externaque, toto in orbe terrarum saepagesi. Victorque omnibus veniam potentibus civibus perperci. I won't read anymore. That's a couple of sentences from Augustus's Res Gestae, which is a text that our 4-year degree students read. Indeed, I've started this with pretty much all of our groups, even the most beginner groups, in the last week or so. So after only a few weeks of learning Latin, a handful of weeks, they're already reading original material. And just as a quick aside, I don't know if you can spot what's in the background there. That's actually a screenshot of me teaching a class on Zoom during the lockdown. That was a bit of an aside. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, one of the things that we do is what we might think of as really quite basic language learning from that. I have coloured in the verbs. If anybody can spot the system of which type of verbs are in green, which are in blue, and which are in purple, then answers on a postcard later. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that some of what we're reading these texts for is still doing very basic language learning. Still teaching the syntax, the morphology, the way that Latin is constructed. That is fundamentally one of the things that we're doing when we're reading original texts. But we're also, of course, doing a lot of other things. While using that few sentences of Res Gestae, I might be trying to get my students to think about Augustus's military campaigns. I might be wanting them to think even more widely about the Roman military system. We might be reading a text like that to think about Augustan propaganda. You know, Augustus does a pretty kind of complicated job of how he presents himself in that supposedly straightforward and simple text. We might therefore be thinking more widely about empire and its legacy. The way that texts like this have been read by multiple generations and used as a way for thinking about what an empire looks like and how it might describe itself. We might also talk about Latin style. And that's not even to mention the fact that there's, of course, the parallel Greek version of this, which gives access to very interesting thinking about the way that Greek and Latin impacted on each other as languages that were spoken bilingually for many centuries. We might also think about the Res Gestae as a monument and a physical object. So how do we do this? Well, the four-year students, a bit like students for intensive Greek, do some pre-term work. They have a September course for the first 2 weeks, early in September, where we introduce them to Latin, but also give them a chance to meet each other. During the course of the terms, we start off with some more basic reading practice, but then very soon we move on to original texts. This term, all of the groups, including those ones who started from absolute scratch with Latin, will read Augustus Reis Gestae. Next term, we'll go on to read a book of Ovid, Metamorphoses 3. And then in the summer term, we'll do some Catullus. They'll also start on Greek in Lent term and have 2 terms of Greek during this, for their first preliminary year. So what about the future? Well, we've hit another bad moment for classics in schools. The change that happened a few years ago, where students stopped taking AS levels and have gone to linear A levels. So where the practice of 4 subjects in the lower 6th, narrowing down to 3 subjects for full A level in the upper 6th, that's actually been a bit of a bad moment for classical subjects. Classical civilization, often taken up as an extra subject, has diminished somewhat. Equally, Greek is really struggling to hold on at all in the state system. It does in a tiny handful, like maybe 1 or 2 schools. Even within independent schools, it's being squashed quite significantly. So it is a moment of danger. On the other hand, we've got our 4-year degree growing and growing successfully, and that's really positive to see. But there are problems. So money is a problem. 4-year students, for us, have to invest an additional 33% in their degree. It's kind of almost at times like they have to pay a kind of tax for not having gone to a school that could offer classical subjects. And that's something that we feel quite uncomfortable about. It's also expensive. I spoke about small classes and intensive teaching. That costs money. We can't teach these students in huge serried ranks in lecture theatres. We do a bit of that, of course, and they do that for some of their areas. But the intensity of the small group language teaching is such an important part of what we do. And there are also other complicated questions about the cultural capital needed to take on board a subject like classics, and questions that are thinking about classics' place in the world. It's at times quite troubled relationship with elitism, with ideas of empire, with ideas of a kind of Western tradition. And classics has to be light on its feet to cope with all of those problems. But it's worth it. We really care about what we're doing with classics. We really care that it remains something that is open and rewarding and important to students and their lives. And as usual, I can't say this better than the students themselves. I asked some 4-year degree students from over the last few years to come up with a few quotes about it, and this is what they came up with. This is just a small sample of the incredibly positive things that people said about studying classics in Cambridge. And because I've had to excerpt these, I'm not sure how strongly it comes out, but when looking at the things that people said about it, the theme of commitment, of friendship, of feeling a cohort with a special identity came out incredibly strongly. And that's something that's really very important to us indeed. And that's my last slide, and I'll stop screen sharing at that point.
Thank you very much, Rosanna. I'm not sure how long we've got you with us, because you might have to zip off. Is
I
that
probably
right?
should zip off now if that's okay.
Okay, that's fine, but thank you.
Yes, a pleasure.
I was wondering whether Charlie could join in at this point, because one of the things that we noticed on Rosanna's slide there was she drew attention to the fact that during lockdown, of course, we kept going with a lot of faculty teaching, but remotely. And these intensive language classes were really thought to be quite important for these students. I mean, they felt this constant connection with the course that perhaps some other students in different university experiences missed. I wondered if Charlie, because I think you've done some work on this, whether you could say something a bit more about how information technology and so on helps with language learning, and what kinds of things you've been using in your classes to help students.
Sure, James, thank you. And thank you, Franco and Rosanna, for those fantastic presentations. Really, really great. When I'm thinking of teaching in the classroom, one thing that that we're seeing a lot of, especially recently, is just projecting images, projecting texts onto the board. And that's become super, super easy. It wasn't so easy. I came here about 20 years ago. It wasn't so easy right at the beginning, but it has been easier, gotten much easier to project text on a board where you can manipulate the text. You can use a whiteboard and draw whatever you want on the board. The technology has come a long way for that. The other, of course, big deal recently is using video in teaching, and not just live video, but recording videos in advance for students to consult, or for students to look at after they've attended a class or attended a lecture. That suddenly, especially because of the pandemic, that's become a real reality that I think the students have really enjoyed and benefited from. And I think we've all updated or learned completely new skills when it comes to technology. Teaching during the pandemic, I think we will all say, on the other hand, that was difficult with groups. Teaching groups online was difficult, but I've thought that teaching very small groups, or just one-on-one or 1-to-2 with language, with text in particular, was actually really quite easily doable, because you could share your screen. You could still look at words and sentences that you wanted to draw attention to pretty easily. So there's a lot going on still, and the pandemic has actually accelerated a lot of the ways that we're teaching. Because of the new advances and the ease with which it is to make a recording and put it online. We've got a centralized information system now within the university that's only come on in the past, especially in the past 5 or 6 years, called Moodle, so that students can access, say, any file that we want them to have access to. There's no reason why they can't access those things immediately, and that's been really good. It's not always easy to navigate, or it's not always easy to go online if you're just using a telephone, and a lot of the kids are using phones, of course, but it's getting better. It gets better every year. And these are actually, Rosanna was talking about, transferable skills. Being able to navigate these kind of information systems is actually, of course, that's what they're going to be doing in work. Being able to use things like Zoom, or being able to use things like Teams has been part of our lives, of course, for the past few years. But even though the pandemic, for all intents and purposes, is effectively over in the UK, it's still actually, I think we're all meeting online more frequently than we've ever done so. And so some of that is still filtering into our teaching. I just had some online teaching when a student said she was too ill to come in, but she felt like she wanted to have a supervision. So we just did it online. It was really good. Those are some obvious things, James, that occur to me that have...
Yeah, good. I mean, I asked because I'm looking at the questions that people are putting in the chat, and one of the people watching is someone who was in one of the very first cohorts on the IG course. So our colleague who's recently retired, Paul Millett, was of course a member of the IG cohort, I think in its second year. I think he was in the 1973 intake, and I think we've got one of his fellow IG students watching us. But of course, it was a very different experience in many ways, I would have thought, in the 70s than the kinds of ways in which we can empower students to take control of the information and so on, and consume it in ways that they're familiar with in other contexts. So various of these things might come up in our discussion. So perhaps if Franco could rejoin us, then I can kind of pose some of these questions to you. So where shall I start? I think Good. So we've got various people asking about Anthony Bowen. I think most of us remember Anthony Bowen, who was the stalwart of the course for a long time ago. He was certainly very much involved, perhaps not in Franco in the very first stages of the course.
He started, I think, in 1990. He was formally appointed, and that, in a sense, represented a very important sort of a further step, because until then the teaching was done by a variety of people, but none of them had as their exclusive or main task that of teaching on the intensive Greek course. And Antonis was the first appointment of its kind, and I've actually had the pleasure to, as it were, interview Anthony to sort of get as much information as I could for him, and he described, as it were, his own period in extremely sort of positive terms, by, if I may put it quite like that, by saying that the faculty allowed him to deal with it as he saw fit, and I'm almost quoting, as it were, and I you know, to comment on, if I may, very briefly on the point that Alan Crease was making, is that I have it in front of me that the prospectus which I've mentioned, from which it is indeed a case that you read Demosthenes, you read against Callicles. How you could have possibly been doing that after only 1 week of preliminary, as it were, training in September, it remains a source of great admiration and puzzlement for those of us who are teaching at the moment. And we actually learn, James may recall that from Paul Millett, that you were, the idea of plunging you at the deep end was practiced perhaps to a very substantial degree. I must say that we don't do quite that. We don't do it quite like that any longer. We don't expect people to read Philoctetes in the pre-term class, as I understand you are asked to do.
Yes, well, it was an age of heroes after all.
Yeah,
I
it
suppose.
really was.
So we've got various questions asking about how this course, the two courses, fit with other aspects of the kind of educational landscape. So Charlie, I mean, could you say something about how the kind of faculty courses and classes that we've been outlining and talking about primarily fit also with college teaching? Because of course, one of the things about Cambridge is that there are these two methods of delivery.
Sure. The colleges are still free to do as they wish, but we are very conscious of having a standard, certainly a standard set of recommendations for colleges. But it must be said that one of the real strengths of Cambridge is that the colleges can deliver individualized teaching in a one-to-one setting or a small group setting where a student feels comfortable in a way that they're not going to feel comfortable, even in a small group of just 5 or 6. If they're with their director of studies or the person that their director of studies has hired to deal with them on a weekly basis for supervisions, this is really a strength of the system, particularly for languages. And that helps us to deliver the intensive program. So we depend completely on an environment where colleges can compensate for what can't happen in a group environment. It can happen in a one-to-one environment. And we really wouldn't be able to do this without the flexibility that the colleges give us. There's no way.
I think that's certainly right, and it's making that a virtue rather than them getting in the way of one another. I think.
Yeah. Of course, there's going to be different teachers. Of course, there's going to be a little bit of confusion. Everybody explains things in a different way, but that's actually, again, it's better for students to appreciate that what we're dealing with is a very complex set of information.
Thank you, and Franco. So people are asking about how we try to do this job of effectively integrating several different sort of entrance strands into one group of classicists. So people are interested in, and perhaps you could say something about how the students on the 4-year course and the IG students are eventually integrated with the 3-year students, and perhaps something about what the faculty provides for those 3-year students in terms of those students who have A-level or equivalent in both languages, of which there still are a significant number.
Yes.
And how we cater for them as well, because we certainly haven't forgotten them.
Well, absolutely, and in large part, the answer lies in what Charlie was saying. That is that that the teaching also happens in colleges, and it is often the case that colleges do try to integrate students from different, certainly students who are studying within the 3-year course who have done Greek at school and those who haven't. Supervisions, for example, are routinely shared. Supervision in Greek literature are routinely shared between people who are expected to read the totality of a certain schedule of text in Greek and those who read a proportion of those texts in Greek and the rest in English for obvious reasons. And very importantly, side by side the program of language teaching, as you would expect, there is a very substantial programs of lectures. And when it comes to lectures, we do not have separate, we have a stream of separate lectures for people doing for people who are doing the course with knowledge of Latin and Greek, or only Latin, or neither. And in fact, and this I think this is what James was alluding at the beginning, we have moved further on in this direction by encouraging, or I should say expecting also, the 4-year course student from the very beginning to start attending those lectures, which until now were exclusively meant for 3-year course students, but which now all students from the beginning attend together. And in practice, I suppose that we do not find that the lecturing that goes on depend so closely and directly from the ability to read Greek independently in the original, should we say, that they cannot be shared by the whole cohort. And so on the one hand, these are, if you like, these are the two extremes of integration. On the one hand, maximum integration in the lectures, where literally all first year students are there together. And at the other hand, in a much more selective and as appropriate way, students sharing, a group, say 2-3 students sharing the same college supervision, and at least 2 of those students may actually be doing a different variant of the course.
I think that sounds right. I mean, my impression, and perhaps Charlie, you could comment on this as a director of studies, is that the students often find themselves in the same year group as they may be a 4-year person, there might be a 3-year person, there might be a 3-year IG person, and so on. They're often sharing supervisions in subjects, they're often working together in various other ways. But I don't think, I would like to think at least, we do a pretty good job of generating a sort of esprit de corps that pulls them all together.
Yeah, definitely. The academic structure contributes to that within the faculty, and that I really noticed that when Rosanna was talking about, people who've experienced the prelims course, they were really talking about a faculty experience, and that she talked about, that cohesion. That happens within a faculty level, but then of course it also is replicated in very different ways in a college setting as well. And our jobs as directors of studies is to facilitate that as much as we can, and the colleges openly encourage us to do that. It's a good situation.
So if I could move to some kind of what I might call some nuts and bolts kind of questions. So one question is how we think our opening up of the classics course to students without Latin at all from school may have had effects on Latin teaching in schools. So I remember this is often worried that if we, and I think this was probably also an argument that was used when the university as a whole stopped requiring students for any subject to have had Latin, or perhaps even in the past Greek at school. So the worry is that, do you think this might, as it were, accelerate what Rosanna was saying about the diminishment of Latin in particularly the maintained sector, if it turns out that students don't need to have Latin from school to come and study classics at university? Do either of you have a kind of perspective on that worry?
I'm aware of the worry, and I can't speak from experience because I have no experience, I have no direct experience of teaching in schools. My impression is that what I can say is that it's never been the case in my experience that a student has told me, yes, I was very interested in Latin. I could have studied it at school, but I decided not to do so because I'd rather leave it until I get to university. I think that is, as it were, that is a fantasy, it seems to me. And so there is another way of looking at what we're doing, which is to say that from every point of view, there is no doubt that the existence of an ab initio course creates de facto a sort of link between what we do here and what could happen in schools, and maybe is not happening yet, which ultimately could help, as it were, at least foster the possibility of the return, at least in a number of schools. And in fact, what seems to me to disprove, as it were, the concern is that since the intensive Latin course has started, it isn't the case that the number of schools offering Latin has diminished. Quite the opposite, quite emphatically so. I mean, it's increasingly the case that schools, and not just academies, but also comprehensive schools, offer Latin. Certainly it is the case in Cambridge. I mean, historically, it is the case that is following the introduction of the 4-year course that a number of local schools have started offering Latin at GCSE. And
good. I mean, that's very helpful because another question is how we deal with a kind of gradated amount of prior experience. So is it the case, the question's put in these terms, is it the case that you would rather have a student who'd learnt no Latin previously so they can get it in the way that you wish to teach it, compared with a student who might do some Latin as an after-school club, or might even have managed to get to GCSE at school or on their own? How do we cope with people with this often quite a large variety of amounts of prior exposure, and how do we fit those in? Perhaps Charlie, you could take that one.
Well, with these increasing numbers applying, there's no question. I've seen the diversity of exposure to Latin as extreme as I've ever seen it. Every year it gets a little bit more extreme. You get people who've had literally just absolutely nothing, to people who've got actually a substantial amount of experience. So if we look at our prelims groups right now, our prelim year, we have 5 groups, and the beginning group is very much at the beginning and they're loving every second of it. Our advanced group is incredibly advanced. That means that they're linguistically able to handle stuff just more rapidly. And, you know, it's not a matter of this or that. There are gradations. So there's other groups in between that that are able to do things at different capacities and different speed, but it's all the same information. I mean, Latin is Latin and Greek is Greek, and the rules don't change. It's just the question of how rapidly an 18 or 19-year-old mind can take on this information. And of course, that's going to be different from person to person. So I can't say that I would rather have tabula rasa or I would rather have someone who's done it in school, because the point is we've got this flexibility within the system to accommodate both.
Yeah, I think it's very much the case that we do really wish to encourage students to do as much of these languages as they can before university.
Yes, definitely.
In part because that makes them, that puts them in a better position to know for sure that this is really the course for them, and to get the most out of the classics course that they possibly can. So that raises another question, I think, Franco, which is, how do we go about examining and evaluating students who are coming to us with different starting points, and 1 year into the course to perhaps even 3 years into the course, can't be expected all of them to have reached the same level? So could you say something about how we've tried to arrange things to ensure a kind of fair system of evaluation?
Yes. The short answer is that we graduate the difficulty of the exams we have at the moment, not only, as you would expect, obviously different exams for people who have learned Greek at school and those who haven't, but we also have different exams for those who start the intensive course with GCSE and those who do not. And to come to the real practicalities of that, there are fundamentally two possible approaches to that: to choose authors and passages which we have good reasons to regard as less demanding, and that is obviously something that applies as to the difference between those who've done Greek at school and those who haven't. But we also now regard as this is perhaps something where things have changed, and for good reasons, that we are less, as it were, precious, I should say, about providing help in the exams, and it has become a feature of examining in very recent year that glosses can take the form, when appropriate, of course, of help with morphology and syntax, and not simply those rather pithy vocabulary entries that people who might have doing the intensive Greek course at the beginning might have experienced as well. But if I may add this, just in case someone might derive from this sort of the story, as it were, the narrative, as they say, is one, should I say, of decline? Well, let me say emphatically no, because I didn't say that at the beginning, but our aspiration and ambition says what we could do in 1 year has actually increased. It was the case, and as I have from a number of participants, of course, that for a period of time, the examination for the intensive Greek course consisted exclusively of passages of text which had been read during the year. We're now exactly, we are confident enough about our ability to learn to translate Greek, to understand Greek independently, that we do not ask our students to translate any of the texts that they read in the classes, but the specifically linguistic element of the examination is conducted entirely on unseen passages.
I think that's right. And while I don't think we're at all complacent, and I think what everyone will have appreciated today, I think, is the care and skill and dedication that we and not to speak of time and effort that we put into trying to make sure these classes work as well as possible. But I do think we have reasons to be happy with our outcomes. So, for example, it's now regularly the case that students who have entered Cambridge either on the 4-year track or in the IG course are appearing very high up in the class lists and performing just as well as any other entrants in papers on Greek literature or Latin literature and so on. So we do think we're doing pretty well. However much, we do still have to adapt to circumstances and keep an eye on what we're doing. I think this is quite important. And as Rosanna said, one of the biggest challenges I think we're facing is a challenge, as it were, brought brought on by success, because it looks very much like the proportions of our entrants coming into the university will be close to 50-50 between the 4-year and the 3-year version, and may tip slightly into a predominance of 4-year students. And that does put pressure on our resourcing. It puts pressure on our time and the teaching. But perhaps, actually, Franco, you might say something about how we're, as it were, using helpful postgraduate teaching and so on to do double duty in various ways.
Yes, that's right. It has become increasingly the case that we consider our responsibility not just that of, as it were, teaching ourselves directly, but also to teach those who teach for us, or as it were, to help them develop professionally. And for a few years now, we have dedicated what we call language teaching training classes, and we systematically invite all PhD students who have an interest in the possibility of teaching the languages to attend these classes, in which gives them, as it were, a hands-on sense of what a reading classes such as they may be asked to themselves offer will look like, and also takes the opportunity to, as it were, advance and revise and consolidate the knowledge of the nuts and bolts of Greek grammar. And it is our impression is that they are actually rather quite graduate students do very much appreciate that opportunity. And it is the case that every year a significant amount of PhD students apply under the scheme, and they are offered a position, should I call it, called graduate teaching assistantship, which, as it were, somehow guarantees to them that the faculty will ask them a certain amount of teaching, which becomes organized, becomes a little less, as it were, casual, and becomes a sort of a recognized part of their professional development, in fact.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, it's a fortunate manner in which we can kind of kill two birds with one stone. We both manage to acquire people whom we can use for our faculty classes, while also, as Franco says, equipping them for the next stage in their careers, those of them who want to go on to be classics teachers in university and in school contexts, in fact, and we have some good track record in doing that. So we've hit 7:30, and we always promise that we don't run on. That's a kind of a regulation that we set ourselves. Thank you very much, all of you who've asked questions. I hope very much we've been able to follow those on. There's one certainly, Franco might be interested to know, we have someone on the call who was in the faculty liaison committee in the early 70s and may well be able to fill in some of those.
I am indeed very interested, and I look forward to hearing. I would really appreciate to find out the possibility of finding out more. Thank you.
So those gnomic minutes might get some fleshing out. That would be really helpful. Thank you very much. We'll just leave this slide up now as we turn off our cameras. I'm very glad you were able to join us. As we said, the faculty does very much appreciate the support of our alumni and their interest in what we do. And there's all manner of ways you can find out a bit more about supporting the faculty in different manners on the website link that you see there. But thank you very much. We hope to see you later in the term. We have a webinar on Nero, and that's our next one, but you'll find details of that and the date from that either in the alumni email that comes around or on the website. So thank you and good evening.